Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to San Antonio, Texas, virtually at least. And my name is Armin Babajanian, Executive Director of the World Affairs Council right here in San Antonio. What a special day we have today with former Secretary of Defense William Perry and Mr. Tom Collina with Ploughshares. Very much looking forward to this. I was born and raised in the U.S., but my family are, you know, they were in Soviet Armenia, and so we grew up, you know, watching everything that has to do with the Cold War and nuclear weapons and proliferation, and so it is not only an honor to be amongst these fine gentlemen, but also personally, it's been awesome to be able to hear and watch and also learn more about this fascinating book that we are about to talk about. I'm going to be very brief in my comments so that we have both the Secretary and Mr. Collina and Suzanne, the moderator, to take the bulk of the presentation. But make sure to go to Ben Bello Books to get this book, and you will have a special code there, which Tom will share with you all, but it's button 30 is the code, and you'll be hearing that later as well. But be sure to check that out and get your really an amazing book here. And thanks to Ploughshares for coordinating this wonderful program. Zach has been awesome, so thank you for the people there who helped organize this. We also have people joining in from our friends in Austin, Texas, the World Affairs Council of Austin, and the World Affairs Council in Corpus Christi. So thank you all for tuning in to listen to this program. And we also have the Office of Congressman Chip Roy, Ambassador Cragen, Harvey Najim, and one of our board members, Carlos Alvarez, who not only does a lot for us here in San Antonio, but he also serves on the National World Affairs Councils of America. So I want to introduce you to Suzanne Murray. She's with Haynes Boone, LLP. Haynes Boone is one of our partners with the World Affairs Councils. Suzanne is a partner there as an attorney. She's also been a regional counsel with the U.S. EPA. She's a product of San Antonio's very own Trinity University and University of New Mexico Law. You could find her full bio in the chat room. Please divert all of your questions in the Q&A, and we will get those. And without further ado, I want to introduce Suzanne, who will take it over and have a discussion with Secretary Perry and Mr. Collina.
Well, thank you so much, Armin. What a pleasure it is to be here this afternoon. I'm still lamenting that we can't be in person, but that the nice opportunity about this is that Zoom allows us the benefit of the exceptional experience of Secretary Perry and Mr. Collina. I would like to say that my background is not in the Cold War or in nuclear armaments. I am an environmental lawyer with a background and experience in climate policy. So pun intended, I'm very unarmed to have this discussion and to perhaps ask some of the more insightful questions that I know that these two panelists could ask. So please, the format of this program is going to allow for people to absorb some of their thoughts and then also to ask questions, which I will be happy to pass along to the panelists. So let's begin. So the format of our discussion today is going to be that Secretary Perry and Mr. Collins are going to give a presentation about the collaboration in their book, The Button, and then they're going to talk about some of the premises in that book about really where we are today with respect to nuclear armament, where we would like to go in the future, and really trying to sort of raise our consciousness about this issue in a time when we are very overwhelmed and perhaps distracted by other issues that are out there right now. They're going to go do a formal slide presentation, and then we will begin the opportunities to ask them some questions. So again, without much more delay, I would like to introduce both Secretary William Perry, who was a former Undersecretary to Defense Secretary to President Carter, and Defense Secretary to President Clinton. Then also Mr. Tom Collins, who is a Principal Policy Director of Ploughshares Funds, a DC-based fund, whose mission is to fund practical solutions to some of the issues that have been raised today, and really an extraordinary organization. I would also recommend that folks who are interested in this topic look into their work and what they do. So without further ado, Secretary Perry, Mr. Collins, welcome to San Antonio, and we're delighted to have you.
Suzanne, thank you so much for having us. Hello to San Antonio, Texas, and beyond. I'm going to share my screen, so let's hope the technology works here. And are we good? Is it looking good? Excellent. Hi, again, Tom Collina. I'm with Ploughshares Fund. And I've had the opportunity to write the button with Secretary Perry, which was published in June. And just a little background, we wrote the book to come out at this time to mark the 75th anniversaries that we have before us now. For example, of course, the July 16th, 75th anniversary of the first nuclear test, and this month, the 75th anniversaries of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And of course, this November, we will choose our next president, as we do every 4 years. And to us, this creates an historic opportunity to debate the future of US nuclear policy. We have now lived with a bomb for 75 years, and we need to ask, what should the next president do to reduce the risk of nuclear war? So first, some context. The current national crisis, of course, we have a battered economy, resurgent coronavirus, racial injustice. All of this creates an important opportunity for change. And as the coronavirus shows, US leaders have been focused on the wrong threats. We are spending too much time on outdated Cold War scenarios and not enough on the real threats we face today. Despite spending some $700 billion a year on defense, many Americans simply do not feel safe. Take, for example, the $1 trillion that the United States plans to spend on nuclear weapons over the next few decades. Much of this is simply not needed, and we see this as a nuclear piggy bank that the next president can break open to pay for what we see are higher priority needs. But at the same time, this is not just about money. We need to change nuclear weapons policy. The bomb does not address the most serious threats we face today, and in fact, it can make those threats even worse. So let's unpack this a bit. We like to show this photo as it tends to focus the mind. Here's President Trump with the infamous football, the briefcase that contains everything the president needs to start nuclear war. This is literally how close we are to nuclear war, every day, every minute, right now. And President Trump, like all presidents, can order an attack on his own authority with no second opinions. Input from Congress or the Secretary of Defense is not required. Now, we don't mean to single out President Trump here. His impulsiveness and disregard for the facts highlight these concerns, but all presidents make mistakes. All are human, and so that's why we strongly feel that no single human should control the future of humanity. Now, we, the American people, choose to give presidents this absolute power. Why? Why do we choose to live so close to the brink of disaster? Well, as we outline in the book, we think it's because US nuclear policy is focused on the wrong threat. So let's get into the arguments we make in the book. We find that US policy is focused on the wrong threat of a surprise attack from Russia. Such an attack is highly unlikely, we find, for the simple reason that it would mean the utter destruction of both sides. And yet US policy has been based on this threat for decades. But here's the big problem, is that this mistaken threat assessment increases the risk of blundering into nuclear war by mistake. We could start nuclear war in response to a false alarm, one of the greatest dangers in the world, and we simply do not need to take this risk. Instead, we must move away from quick launch policies and give the president more decision time as we'll discuss. So Bill, turning to you, you had a front row seat to the arms race and met with Soviet and Russian officials many times. Some might challenge our central assertion that a surprise attack from Russia is not a likely threat. What would you say to that?
Well, Tom, when I was secretary, I met with dozens of Russian officials from the president on down. And since then, I met with hundreds of Russians and formed, I think, the considered opinion. And my judgment is that the Russians are not stupid. The Russians are not suicidal. And therefore, they will not launch a surprise attack. They're not suicidal. We have been focusing on the wrong threat. But there is still a danger, and the danger is that we will blunder into a nuclear war.
Thank you. This perceived threat of a surprise attack drives the military requirement that we must launch nuclear weapons at all times within minutes. And this in turn drives three dangerous policies. First, that the president has sole authority to launch nuclear weapons within minutes with no second opinions or oversight. And this is something that most Americans do not fully appreciate. Second, that the president can order a first strike and is not limited to retaliation. And again, I think most Americans believe that the United States would limit itself to retaliation to second strike, but in fact, the president has authority for starting nuclear war. And third, that the president can launch hundreds of land-based ballistic missiles, ICBMs, on warning of attack without waiting for proof of attack. And we spent quite a bit of time in the book on the dangers of these policies. And Bill, if you could give us your sense of why this combination of policies is so dangerous.
Perhaps what emphasizes the danger most of all is the reality of false alarms. They're not theoretical. I have been personally experienced 3 of them during the time I was in government, 3 false alarms. One of them was particularly dangerous. This was during the Cold War. I was asleep at 3 o'clock in the morning and I received a phone call. As I picked up the phone, the voice on the other end identified himself as the watch officer at the North American Air Defense Command. And the first thing he said to me was that his computers were showing 200 ICBMs on the way from the Soviet Union to the United States. For one horrible moment, I thought we were about to live a catastrophic, world-ending disaster. But he quickly went on to say he had concluded it was a false alarm. And he was calling me to see if I could help him determine what had gone wrong with his computers. Well, I was not able, over the telephone, to figure out what had gone wrong with his computers. It took us several days. We finally determined there was a faulty chip, a simple microchip, faulty chip in his computers. On one other occasion, a year earlier, we had also had a false alarm. And that time it was a human error. The new operator, computer operator coming on duty that night had mistakenly put into the computer, instead of the operating tape for the computer, a simulation of an attack. And so the computer was showing a very realistic attack. That was a very near thing. So we have had false alarms, sometimes human error, sometimes machine error. Machines still err, humans still err, so we will have more false alarms. They are not a theoretical danger, they are very real.
Thank you. Trying to get this thing to advance, just a second here. All right. Bill, let's expand on the dangers of sole authority for a minute. In 1963, President Kennedy warned that we would stumble into nuclear war due to accident, miscalculation, or madness. Can you explain what he meant by this?
Well, the president can first of all have get bad information. And the poster child of that is the Cuban Missile Crisis, where President Kennedy was making decisions that would affect the future of our civilization. He and Gorbachev, neither of them wanted a nuclear war. Both of them were being urged into military action by their advisors. President Kennedy was trying to hold it off as long as he could. At the time he was making this decision, he did not know, because we did not know, who were advising him, that the Russians, besides having the medium-range missiles in Cuba, also had short-range tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba. And those weapons were operational and already had the nuclear weapons connected. So if President Kennedy had accepted the recommendation, the unanimous recommendation of his military advisors, and conducted a conventional military attack on Cuba, our troops would have been met on the beachhead with nuclear weapons that have been decimated by those nuclear weapons, and a general nuclear war would surely have followed. President Kennedy later said that he thought the chance the Cuban Missile Crisis erupting into a nuclear catastrophe was about 1 chance in 3, 1 in 3, that the civilization would be ended. But even when he said that, he did not know about the tactical nuclear weapons. So very likely that the likelihood was much higher than 1 in 3, perhaps greater than 50-50. That's how close we came to ending our civilization. In terms of all of our nuclear policies, which give the president the sole authority, assume that the president is stable and rational. But that's not always been true. Our slide here depicts President Trump as a possible unstable decider, but we're not picking on President Trump. There have been several cases where we should be concerned about this. One of them, indeed, was President Kennedy, who, during the time of his presidency, was taking heavy medications for pain he was suffering. Those medications might at some times have affected his ability to decide properly. President Nixon, during the last few months of his presidency, was drinking heavily, and his advisors were very much concerned that he make a wrong decision. And President Carter, as I've already explained to you, was subjected to not 1, but 2 false alarms at the time he was president. Tom, back to you.
Thank you. Computer issues. Why isn't this moving? All right. So let's move into solutions and what we can do about this. Really, the focus of our book and our call to action is that the next US president can and must reorient nuclear policy away from a surprise attack to preventing accidental war. And Bill, if you could lay out the main arguments that we do in the book for how to do this.
The first and perhaps most important thing is for the president to surrender his sole authority, to share that authority for launching nuclear weapons with Congress. In the case where he is using them first, he should by all means end that sole authority. It can be argued that we have the sole authority because he has to move quickly. But we believe just the opposite. It's a huge mistake to make a decision to launch nuclear weapons to end our civilization in a few minutes. He should take more time and should have more consultation. So number 1 is end the sole authority. The second thing that needs to be done is to prohibit the first use of nuclear weapons. That's closely associated with the first one. We should prohibit the first use of nuclear weapons. Our nuclear weapons should have 1 and only 1 purpose, and that is to deter the use of nuclear weapons against us or against any of our allies. The third action that can be taken is to phase out our land-based ICBMs. We do not need them for deterrence, and they are an accident waiting to happen. They are the most likely cause of an accidental or nuclear war, and we should get rid of that unnecessary danger. Don, back to you.
Thanks, Bill. So we're going to wrap up this presentation so we can get to audience questions. But just to wrap up, to reiterate that nuclear weapons are indeed the president's weapons. And every 4 years, we have a chance to change this nuclear policy. The 75th anniversary of the bomb and the current national crisis should inspire us to rethink our approach to national security. U.S. nuclear policy is doing us more harm than good, and it magnifies the dangers we face from the most likely nuclear threat, blundering into nuclear war by mistake. The next president can and should fix this. We know this will be hard. We are up against 75 years of outdated thinking and a $50 billion industry. And history tells us that major change like this is possible only if led by the president from the top with public pressure to deliver. So we are looking to educate the next president and the public like you with events like this. Thank you very much. And if you're interested in buying the book, please go to benbellabooks.com and use the code button30 for 30% off. And if you like us, the book that is, please rate us on Amazon. Thank you very much. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Well, thank you, Tom. Thank you, Secretary Perry. I think before we start unpacking kind of some of the ideas that you outline in the book about the dangers of a president having sole authority and some of the ideas that you have, suggestions you have for amending that, can you just tell me a little bit, from your perspective, what do you think the value is today of nuclear armaments as a deterrent?
It's not clear that we need to deter anybody from attacking us, but also it's a possibility we do. And since that would be such a catastrophe, the nuclear weapons we have are there designed to deter that from happening. The question is, how many do we need to do that? We have more than 4,000 nuclear weapons, of which 1,550 are deployed. It's certainly conceivable that we could deter an attack with 100 or 200 nuclear weapons, which, for example, both England and France and China believe they can deter with a few hundred weapons. So we have many more clearly than we need. Whether we should get down to 1,000 or down to a few hundred, we can achieve deterrence with far fewer weapons than we have. And the more weapons we have, the more dangerous it is.
And do you think, I know you talked a little bit about some of the land-based missiles, but are there certain weapons in our nuclear arsenal that are probably more vulnerable to things like cyber attack? Are there places that we should look first to try to start eliminating some of the threat?
Mm-hmm. The ICBMs are the most dangerous, and why we recommend phasing them out. Because of the ICBMs, they're located in fixed silos, known locations, and they're so vulnerable to attack. They are an accident waiting to happen, and we should phase them out so we reduce the primary cause of a accidental war. Tom, over to you.
Just to add that, now is the time to have a debate about the future of the land-based ballistic missiles. But the U.S. government is on the verge of signing a contract for $100 billion to replace all 400 of our land-based ICBMs. And we're saying that we shouldn't have these weapons at all. So, and that we don't need them and they're not needed for deterrence. So we can save the country a lot of money by not moving forward with this program. And take those funds and spend them on much higher priorities, whether it be countering coronavirus, rebuilding the economy, or what have you.
Okay, give me 1 second. I just got buzzed from some questions from folks that are viewing the presentation. So, okay, the first question is, any idea how the Biden-Harris administration might feel about implementing some of the changes that you're advocating? So I guess maybe I would ask you to just sort of reiterate some of the changes so that we kind of have a good foundation, and then if you'd like to take that question.
Sure. I think a potential Biden administration would be quite good on nuclear weapons policy. For example, the Biden administration has come out, the Biden campaign has come out with a policy on nuclear weapons that supports, for example, sole purpose. That is, that the sole purpose of nuclear weapons should be to deter the use of nuclear weapons by others. We support that as well. That is very close to a no first use policy, and it would go a long way to removing the sole authority for forced use from the president. The Biden campaign also supports two other things that we agree with. One is extending the New START treaty. This is the last treaty in force that limits US and Russian strategic nuclear forces. If it lapses, this will be the first time in 50 years we have limits on these forces. So we feel very strongly that that treaty should be extended. And the third thing is to seek to bring the United States back into the Iran nuclear deal. This was a deal between the Obama administration and Iran to freeze and roll back Iran's nuclear program. It was working quite well until up to the point that the Trump administration withdrew. We support getting back into that deal, and the Biden campaign does as well.
I concur with what Tom said, but I'd like to add to it that President Obama, during the period he was in office, supported many of these ideas, but was not able to make them happen. It's not enough to have a president wanting to do these things, believing they should be done. You have to have an energized public backing up and supporting that president. That's why our campaign to educate the public is so important to our thinking.
So, Secretary Perry, to follow up on that thought, and how would you envision making a transition from sole authority to a shared authority? What would that look like?
It could be done in a number of ways. One way would be to have some subgroup of the Congress, perhaps the 4 leaders of the Congress, be required to meet with the president and join him in that decision. That way we'd have both the executive branch and the legislative branch. That would be much closer to what our Constitution calls for, which requires the Congress to declare war. They were very clear that the president did not have that authority. The Congress has to be involved to declare war. So if we made that change, that would be in the spirit of our constitutional requirement for declaring war, because launching nuclear weapons at somebody is certainly a declaration of war. It's the most extreme declaration of war you could possibly think of. Tom, do you want to add anything to that?
Just add that the other way to remove sole authority for first use from the president would be to have the president to declare a no first use pledge. In other words, that the United States would never use nuclear weapons first under any circumstances. And so then the president would still maintain sole authority for retaliation. And to us, that's okay, because that would be constitutional in the sense that the Constitution allows the president to take actions on his own to retaliate against attacks. So the United States could either, the president could either share sole authority for first use with Congress or declare that there shall be no first use.
I'm going to ask you another question from some of the folks participating in the presentation. Okay, what safeguards are currently in place to identify false alarms? For example, we have a direct line to Russia, but what about other nuclear countries like Pakistan, India, North Korea?
Well, I would say that there really is no safeguard to detecting a false alarm other than waiting to see if the attack is real or not. And this is one of the main concerns we have with our current policy, is that a president could get a warning of an attack, say in the middle of the night, as happened in Secretary Perry's time. And that attack could be a false alarm, and probably is a false alarm, particularly given the cyber risks that our command and control system faces today. I mean, I think most people don't realize that just like our computers, our command and control system is vulnerable to cyber attack. So you could have a situation where some entity has hacked into the command and control system and spoofs the system into thinking that an attack is underway. And therefore, we don't want the president making a quick decision, given that the attack could be false. We want the president to take his time to determine whether the attack is real or not, and then take action. The last thing in the world we should want is a quick decision by a president initiating nuclear war in response to a false alarm. That is a disaster, a nightmare that we should be taking many steps to prevent.
I'd like to add to what Thomas said by going back to the story I told you about my getting a call in the middle of the night. Before the watch officer had called me, he had already called the White House. This is before he realized it was a false alarm. He called the White House. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. The call went to the National Security Advisor. which is a big Brzezinski. Brzezinski had not yet called the president, was about to, when he got a follow-up call a minute or two later, telling him, whoops, ignore that, it was a false alarm. Had that second call not come through, Brzezinski would have woken the president. President being awoken at 3 o'clock in the morning, nobody, no context, no way to consult other people, no way to figure out what was really going on, would have had about 5 minutes to determine whether or not to launch our ICBMs before they were destroyed in their silos. That's why I say that our ICBMs are an accident waiting to happen, because it's their presence and their vulnerability which forces the president to make that terrible civilization-ending decision.
If I could just add, a US launch, even in response to a false alarm, would probably be a very large launch. And the Russians would probably respond with their own very large launch. So we really are talking about the end of civilization.
So on that note, I'm going to try to combine a couple of questions that folks sent, really about not just the role of nuclear weapons as a deterrent for our own domestic security, but the role that the United States plays, and historically the role that is played with respect to the way that other countries view their security. So there's a couple of questions have come that say, so how does the U.S. deal with allied concerns about NFU, like for example, Japan? And what are your views on U.S. air deliverable nuclear weapons stored in Europe? That was a 1-2 punch, sorry.
Well, I'll just start by saying I completely sympathize with allied concerns. At the same time, we need to explain, the United States government that is, to our allies that first use of nuclear weapons is not required for extended deterrence. We have made a pledge to our allies that if they are attacked with nuclear weapons, we will come to their defense, and therefore through that we will deter any nuclear attack against them. That does not require first use. First use is not required for extended deterrence. So from our perspective, the United States can move to a no first use position and still maintain an extended deterrent. And we need to explain to our allies and reassure them that a no first use position does not undermine US extended deterrence.
And I would add to what Tom says, if one of our allies is attacked with conventional weapons, we would respond not with nuclear weapons, but with conventional weapons. We do not need nuclear weapons to defend our allies from a conventional attack. Our conventional forces are the most powerful in the world.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to go to another question here. Well, actually, I'm going to repeat the follow-up too on. So, what are your views on air deliverable nuclear weapons stored in Europe?
There are about 150 or so US nuclear weapons stored in various air bases across Europe. My opinion is that these are not necessary militarily, that if the United States wanted to use nuclear weapons in a European war context, we have plenty based in the United States and in the oceans, that this is really a political symbol. It's a symbol of US support for NATO, that those weapons are there. I think the United States should support NATO, but I think we should find a different way to make that political statement because those weapons are now a liability in terms of security. They're too close to Russia. They're too close to unstable regions where those weapons could be lost. For example, the weapons in Turkey are not likely to be used in any strategic scenario, but are vulnerable to the instability in that country today. So from my perspective, we would be safer if we removed those weapons back to the US mainland.
Secretary Perry, do you have any follow-up or?
I concur with what Thomas said.
Okay.
I think the weapons we have in Europe are more of a liability than an asset. We should remove them after careful consultation with our allies explaining why we're doing that.
So I'm going to combine a couple of sentiments and some other questions here too that really kind of touch on what you laid out before about the risks of an impulsive president or someone who makes an impulsive decision based on either incorrect facts or just a false alarm. So it sort of turns the tables on, well, what do we do about impulsive leaders in other countries who also have these armaments? And some of the specific questions are, how much reliance do we have on people like Stanislav Petrov? And what assurances do we have that folks like in North Korea and Turkey won't use nuclear weapons to assert other positions?
Well, first of all, we have good reason to believe that these leaders are not suicidal, as I've mentioned before. But they may be impulsive, which is something to be worried about, and they may not understand fully what's going on. I think the best thing we can do to lower that danger, since we can't control who the leaders of other countries are, the best thing we can do is to pledge seriously a no first use policy, and then redeploy our weapons, and to make that pledge realistic and meaningful. So if a country believes that we're not going to use nuclear weapons first, that will greatly reduce the number of scenarios in which they might be tempted to use their nuclear weapons first. Tom, what do you want to add to that?
Just to add that I think, as great as we feel the false alarm danger is here in the United States, we think it's even greater danger in Russia. Russia has a similar policy of presidential sole authority, President Putin in this case, but Russia has even less effective early warning system. So we think the Russian president would have even less time to make a decision under warning about whether an attack is real or false. So we would like the United States to declare a no first use policy, to move away from sole authority, in part to help Russia move away from those policies as well. Because of course, if Russia launches nuclear weapons by mistake, those weapons are probably coming over here.
All right, well, that's a perfect lead into the next question, which is, what are the UK and French procedures for nuclear use? Like, are there any guides out there for us to look to?
There have been things written about French and British policies. They tend to be contradictory. Leaders of nations tend to be pretty opaque about what their policies are. I imagine they're pretty similar to US and Russian policies, but I don't have anything more specific than that.
Secretary Perry, do you have any other insight into that? Like, what?
I can't add anything to that, no. It's a very murky area.
Yeah. So let's go back kind of to the premise of your book and talk about changing the first, or having a no first use policy. Like, practically speaking, what would that look like? And what are some of the steps, Tom, that your group and others may be supporting to get information to folks if they want to become involved?
Right, so there's two ways to get to no first use. Probably the easiest is that the president just declares it, because the president has so much authority when it comes to nuclear weapons policy. That the president would just declare no first use. We're not going to have first use in any situation. But it could also come from Congress. This would be harder to do because it's harder to get Congress to agree on anything. But there is legislation in Congress supported in the Senate by Senator Warren and in the House by Congressman Adam Smith to declare a no first use policy. So if people feel strongly that we should have a no first use policy, they can certainly call their member of Congress and ask them to support this legislation. They can support groups that are looking to educate the public about no first use, like Ploughshares and groups that Ploughshares supports, Arms Control Association, Global Zero, Friends Committee on National Legislation. There are many of them. And get involved, get educated, because what we really need, as much as we need presidential leadership, we need the public to be involved, to press their leaders to do more on nuclear security.
I think I would add something more to that. Declaring no first use is one thing, but having a credible no first use policy is another. How does your no first use policy become credible to other countries? One way of doing that is to redeploy your forces, so it's obvious you're not intending to use them first. For example, our bombers, for many, many years now, nuclear bombers do not fly with nuclear bombs on them. The bombs are separated from the delivery vehicles, the airplanes. We could do the same thing with our ICBMs. As long as we have the ICBMs, we could take the warheads off the ICBMs and store them separately. That would make our no first use policy, I think, quite credible.
just to add, the reason we feel that China has a declared no first use policy. And the reason we feel that's credible is because China stores its warheads separately from its missiles. So it would not be able to respond immediately and would not be able to launch immediately. So we could do the same thing, and we should do the same thing.
So I'm just going to add one question we just got. So to add on to what you just said, Secretary Perry, would reduced nuclear deterrent be sea-based as well? Is that a direction that you would recommend?
I didn't understand the question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Would a reduced nuclear deterrent be sea-based instead of the land-based missiles?
What we would recommend is that a deterrence be based on our sea-based forces, our Trident submarines, and our air-based. We have nuclear bombers. Our nuclear bombers alone have enough nuclear capability to destroy any country in the world. So they're quite a formidable force. We don't think much about them and talk much about them, but that's quite a credible force. So yes, I just would say one other thing. We talk about a sea-based force as you think of the submarine with some missiles in it. One Trident submarine alone has more nuclear destructive power than you can imagine. It's more than enough. One submarine, more than enough to destroy any country in the world, completely destroy any country in the world. So this is a formidable force. You know, we think back to what the destruction done in Hiroshima and Nagasaki 75 years ago. That was one bomb, about 15 kilotons. Most of the bombs in our force are about 10 times that destructive power. Some of them have 100 times that destructive power. And we have 4,000 of them, not one or two. So the destructive power of our nuclear forces is really beyond imagination.
Well, thank you. I mean, this has been an exceptional education and a delight to hear both of your perspective on the book and to answer questions. I have one other last question that I've been getting, I've had several ask, which is really a little bit off topic, but maybe it follows on your thought, Secretary, is that so what next? Do you have any thoughts about the use of nuclear power or using nuclear as an energy source? Are there more sort of productive things that we could do with this resource, or what does the future hold?
Well, I'm a strong believer that we have to do things to improve our climate. And that's going to involve putting much less carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Nuclear power has one great virtue, is we get all that energy without spewing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So that's a benefit of nuclear power. The danger of nuclear power is that it lends itself to proliferation to nuclear weapons. The primary example of that is North Korea, which had a nuclear reactor for the nominal purpose of generating power, but then they used that, diverted that power to making that reactor to making nuclear bombs. We have various safeguards against that happening in the world, but nevertheless, that is the danger of nuclear power. All things considered, I think we can monitor nuclear power safely, and therefore I think nuclear power is still an important asset until such time as we have wind power and solar power being of a capacity to replace nuclear. That's not going to be for many decades in the future. So I think we're going to continue to depend on nuclear power. And our challenge is to make sure that it's being used safely and is not diverted to the use of nuclear weapons. Tom, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, just that, you know, I think we have a real challenge ahead of us to get to the point where our question is, you know, what do we do with nuclear weapons or power if we're not dealing with weapons? I mean, we're at a point where we're entering a new arms race with Russia. Both the United States and Russia are rebuilding their nuclear forces, essentially all of them. The United States is planning to spend over $1 trillion to rebuild its nuclear forces over the next 30 years. And at the same time, we're tearing down the arms control structure that ended the last Cold War and the last arms race. So I think we really are at an inflection point, if you will, where if we don't start efforts to stop rebuilding the arsenals and stop a new arms race, we're not going to have this luxury of thinking about, how to reduce this danger. We're going to be in the much more dangerous situation of controlling an out of control arms race. So I think we need to see the situation for what it is and realize that we need to take some pretty significant actions that involve people taking more engagement, a more active role in the policies of their leaders when it comes to nuclear weapons.
I don't think you guys summed it up better than that. Thank you so much, Mr. Collina. Thank you so much, Secretary Perry. I'm going to turn it back over to Armand and do one more plug for the book, The Button. Thank you very much for your time today.
Our pleasure.
What a wonderful presentation. This is one of my favorite programs that I've had yet. So we appreciate you all's time. I know you're busy doing a lot of rounds, but the people and the supporters in San Antonio greatly appreciate both of you for taking time. I do want to make sure to plug the benbellowbooks.com and also the discount you will receive as a supporter of the World Affairs Council. I believe it's a 30% discount. Is that right, Tom?
That is right.
The code is button30, so be sure to do that. I want to thank the University of Incarnate Word for their support, for their sponsorship. Helen Lutz is on backstage helping out. Samantha Scory with the World Affairs Council also helping out in backstage, if you could call it. Thank you, Suzanne, so much with Haynes Boone LLP. Thank you so much for doing a great job moderating, and Haynes Boone for letting us borrow you for the past hour and a half or so. So we really appreciate the support we get from Haynes Boone LLP. We can't do this without you all's support, so please look in the chat room for membership opportunities and to make a donation to the World Affairs Council. We can't do this without you all's support. I do have a last minute question since we have time. How did this collaboration come about, and are there future projects in place?
A wonderful question. Tom, I'll let you add the first one, and I'll talk about the second one.
Well, I think part of it was Bill and I realizing that we needed each other, that this was not an effort of just getting presidents and senior decision makers or getting the public involved. We needed both. We needed senior officials and we needed the public. And Bill, there's no better person than Bill to explain these issues to senior government officials. And I've been spending more of my time doing public education. So we figured we'd be a great team, and it's been a tremendous pleasure. And I'm just so glad he agreed to work with me.
I would add to that, about 5 years ago, I wrote another book on the same subject by myself. This was called My Journey at the Nuclear Brink, partly autobiographical, but also describing the kind of dangers and problems that Tom and I wrote about. But it was written more for the specialists in the field. And as time went on, I could see it was not getting through to the public. And so I wanted a way of getting through to the public. And my usual way of writing and speaking is to a specialist article wasn't appropriate for that. So Tom and I made a good combination. I had the background and the government experience, and he had a way of communicating closely and directly with the public. And that's our hope, that this book, The Button, will be accessible to the public, and especially accessible to young people. And I might also mention that beyond the book, we have just in the last few months come up with a podcast. The podcast is called At the Brink. It's now available. The first 4 seasons of that are now available. And I would urge you to go to our website, wjperryorg.com, and look at that podcast. It's basically intended to be directed to younger people. In fact, the organizer and narrator of the content is my granddaughter, Lisa Perry, who's only 32. We had the idea of having a voice that would speak to young people, and we hope that this will get the message across to young people, because to be honest, I've sort of given up on my generation of dealing with this problem. We're trying to get through to the younger generation. Thank you.
That's wonderful, and we'll share that link when we follow up with our guests with a recording of this, and also Ploughshares website, which is a great resource to have. So please be sure to look at their website. A lot of resources for everybody. And I will say with this book, you know how they say you can't judge a book by its cover? I love the cover. So whoever came up with that did a phenomenal job, and I look forward to finishing the book. Again, Mr. Secretary, thank you. I've admired you for many years, and appreciate you for coming on. Tom, thank you so much for coming on and for this gift that you have provided to the American people. And Suzanne Murray with Haynes Boone LLP. Thank you all very much. You all have a wonderful weekend, and make sure you get the button.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
Armand. Thank you, Secretary.
be here.
Thank you, Mr. Collina. Okay, bye-bye.